Stop everything. Pause for a moment. There's a structural crisis building between two countries that share the world's most integrated supply chain, and almost no one reporting on it understands what's actually happening. On January 24th, less than 5 days ago, a public threat was issued. A 100% tariff on all Canadian goods. Not selective, not negotiable in its framing. All. But here's the part no one is talking about. That threat is not the crisis, it's the symptom. The real story is a cascading failure in the institutional architecture that has held North American trade together for 32 years, and that failure is accelerating in real time. Let's establish the timeline first, because time is the thing that matters now. We are sitting at Thursday, January 29th, 2026. 5 days have passed since the tariff threat was issued. In normal trade disputes, 5 days would be nothing, a negotiating position, a rhetorical move. But the current structure of US-Canada relations is not normal anymore, and the deadline architecture built into the remaining mechanisms for preventing escalation is collapsing faster than institutions can respond to it. Here's what happened, stripped of the noise. On January 24th, Canada announced a strategic trade arrangement with China. Not a comprehensive free trade agreement, the language was carefully chosen. Targeted tariff resolutions, specific caps on Chinese electric vehicles entering Canada, targeted reductions on canola seed tariffs, tariff relief on select seafood and commodities. The arrangement was negotiated as a response to years of U.S. protectionism that had left Canadian agricultural sectors economically stranded. The moment that arrangement was announced, Washington responded with a threat of a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods. The stated justification was national security. Canada could become a transshipment route for Chinese goods, specifically electric vehicles and components, into the U.S. market. The claim was framed not as a trade disagreement, but as a sovereignty violation, a potential breach of continental defense. And here is where you need to understand the institutional fragility. This framing changes everything about how the response must legally and politically occur. When a trade dispute is framed as a trade dispute, there are mechanisms, negotiation tracks, dispute resolution procedures built into the USMCA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. But when the same dispute is reframed as a national security issue, those mechanisms become secondary. The legal pathway shifts to Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, an instrument originally designed to protect critical defense industrial capacity. And once national security framing is applied, the speed and breadth of enforcement becomes nearly unlimited. This is not a hypothetical. This is documented policy procedure. The problem is that Canada's government is operating on a different timeline and under a different political constraint than Washington is. Canada's January 2026 political transition has shifted the Canadian posture toward trade diversification, deliberately, strategically. The message from Ottawa was, North American integration alone is a vulnerability. Canada needs optionality. That optionality means China. It means other markets. It means reducing dependence on a single trading partner. Washington's response was immediate and unambiguous. If you pursue that path, we will make the cost prohibitive. Here's the part that should concern you. Both governments are now locked in a position where backing down carries domestic political costs that may be larger than the economic costs of escalation. In Canada, the political mandate is for trade diversification. Reversing that arrangement with China would signal weakness to the domestic constituency that voted for that mandate. But in the United States, the political signal being sent is that any attempt by Canada to build independent trade relationships will be met with punitive force, and that threat has to be credible, which means eventually it has to be executed. The countdown has already started. We know from multiple institutional sources that the largest remaining lever is the USMCA review scheduled for July 1st, 2026. That is 155 days away. That review is a built-in mechanism for renegotiating the agreement itself. It is also, functionally, a deadline, because the longer the tariff threat remains unresolved, the more it functions as leverage in those negotiations. And the more leverage it provides, the more incentive exists to keep it active rather than resolve it. What we are watching is a situation where the threat of tariffs may actually be more valuable as a negotiating instrument than the tariffs themselves would be, which means the threat may persist and escalate right through the summer with no actual resolution, until the agreement review becomes the focus point and the negotiating table shifts to fundamentals. But there's a cascading problem layered on top of this timeline, and this is where the institutional fragility becomes genuinely dangerous. Canadian businesses right now are making real-time decisions about supply chains. They do not have 155 days. They have weeks. A 100% tariff is not a negotiating position. It is an existential threat to any business model that relies on U.S. market access or U.S. integrated supply chains. The moment a business calculates that the tariff threat has even a 20 or 30% probability of becoming real, the incentive structure flips. It becomes cheaper and less risky to relocate operations, source from new suppliers, build new relationships than to sit and wait for a negotiated resolution. This is happening right now. We can see it in the data from the third quarter of 2025. Canadian exports fell 4% in a single quarter. Not the tariffed sectors alone, all sectors, even sectors untouched by actual tariffs. The uncertainty itself became the economic event. Businesses and customers on both sides of the border became reluctant to do business with each other. The relationship broke psychologically before it broke legally. And there is another layer. Canadian businesses that previously routed imports through the United States, roughly 1/4 of all non-US imports, are now rerouting directly into Canada. This is more expensive. It creates inflation. It increases logistical complexity, but it reduces exposure to US border risk. The aggregate effect is that Canada's supply chain is actively disaggregating from the continental system in real time, whether or not any actual tariff is ever imposed. Here's what that means. Even if a negotiated settlement is reached tomorrow, the supply chain reconfiguration will take years to reverse. Vendors will have been resourced. Contracts will have been rewritten. Investment will have been redirected. The institutional relationships that made North American integration work are being replaced by something else, something more fragmented, something less efficient but less risky from each actor's perspective. The Bank of Canada understands this. They held interest rates steady in January, but their messaging indicates explicit concern about downside risks from trade uncertainty. They are preparing for a scenario where growth slows because businesses and consumers are making decisions based on institutional instability rather than economic fundamentals. That is not a technical monetary policy issue. That is the central bank signaling that the institutional framework itself is in question. Here's the part that resembles a crisis. All of this is happening during a period when the US is simultaneously implementing tariffs globally. US tariffs on countries around the world are elevated compared to early 2025. The global trade environment is deteriorating. And within that deteriorating environment, Canada is the one relationship where the US government has explicitly connected trade disputes to national security. That signals priority. That signals that Washington is willing to accept the cost of a break in this relationship if Canada does not comply with the strategic constraint. And Canada has signaled that it will not comply. The government in Ottawa has adopted diversification as a core policy. That is not negotiable away. Even if the specific arrangement with China is modified or delayed, the strategic direction will not reverse, which means the underlying point of conflict, whether Canada has the sovereign right to pursue trade relationships outside North America, remains unresolved. Both governments are now positioned such that some form of escalation is probable over the next 155 days. Here's what the possible outcomes look like, and none of them are actually good. The first scenario is managed escalation with a negotiated pause. Tariffs are threatened, maybe some are implemented on a narrow range of goods, negotiations occur, and a face-saving settlement is reached before the July review. The damage is limited. Supply chains partially reconfigure but then restabilize. This is the best case. And even in this scenario, the relationship is damaged, trust is eroded. The precedent is set that Canada's trade sovereignty can be conditionally overridden by US force. That becomes institutional memory. Future behavior will be constrained by this experience. The second scenario is prolonged uncertainty with tariffs held active as leverage. The threat persists through the summer. The review in July becomes a pressure point. Negotiations intensify around fundamental USMCA terms, and tariffs remain as an instrument throughout. In this scenario, supply chain reconfiguration accelerates. Investment is frozen. Hiring becomes cautious. Growth slows. Inflation remains elevated because direct routing of imports is more expensive than continental routing. This scenario creates low-level institutional pain over an extended period. It's not a spike. It's a sustained pressure that degrades the system gradually. The third scenario is targeted escalation. Tariffs are implemented on specific sectors, automobiles, metals, sensitive industrial categories. These are the sectors most integrated with the continental system. The pain is concentrated in manufacturing regions. Layoffs occur in affected areas. Supply chains break in those sectors. But the broader economy is partially insulated. This scenario is politically possible because it allows the US government to demonstrate force while leaving sectors that matter to the broader US consumer economy less damaged. But the damage to Canada is disproportionate. Manufacturing capacity leaves, investment never returns. The fourth scenario is the one no one wants to fully acknowledge. Tariffs become real and comprehensive. Trade volume collapses. Supply chains that took decades to build are dismantled in months. Prices spike. Unemployment rises. The USMCA, which has governed 30 years of integration, becomes functionally obsolete. The legal question of whether to formally withdraw or to renegotiate becomes secondary to the economic reality. North America stops functioning as an integrated trade zone. This has happened before, not with Canada and the US, but the pattern is documented. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 was implemented with similar rhetoric. protection of domestic industry, national sovereignty, defense of workers. It triggered global retaliation. Trade collapsed. And the institutional fragility it created became one of the factors that fed into the conditions for global conflict in the following decade. That's not a prediction. That's a historical observation about what happens when trade systems break suddenly and the political narrative frames that break as necessary. None of that is destiny. But all of it is trajectory. And trajectory is something that can be altered, but not without recognizing what the current direction actually is. So here's what you need to understand about the institutional silence surrounding this crisis. The corporate sector in both countries is not publicly demanding resolution. Why? Because many corporations benefit from uncertainty. Supply chain disruption creates competitive advantage for some firms while eliminating others. Tariffs create protection for some U.S. manufacturers. The incentive structure for a coordinated private sector response to preserve the system is weaker than the incentive structure for individual firms to position themselves for advantage in a disrupted environment. The political sector, meanwhile, is divided. There are constituencies in both countries that benefit from diversification away from each other. In the U.S., there are political voices that see Canada's China arrangement as a vulnerability that must be corrected through force. In Canada, there are political voices that see diversification as an essential survival strategy that must be protected even at the cost of the U.S. relationship. The institutional alignment that would normally produce a resolution is fractured. The media coverage of this crisis is still using the vocabulary of trade disputes, tariff negotiations, concessions, compromises. But the underlying reality is a fundamental strategic disagreement about whether North American integration should continue in its current form. That is not a trade issue. That is a structural question about the future of the relationship. And those are harder to resolve because they are not amenable to the usual negotiating language. The countdown is functioning on multiple timelines simultaneously. There is the immediate timeline, days and weeks, where supply chain decisions are being made. There's the medium timeline. The next 155 days until the USMCA review. There is the longer timeline, the next 5 to 10 years, where the structural direction of North American trade will be determined by the choices made over the next few months. What is unfolding is not being fully documented as it happens. The analysis is fragmented across institutional sources, corporate communications, government statements, and economic data. No single narration of the crisis exists yet, but the components of the crisis are visible. The supply chain data shows disaggregation. The political statements show irreconcilable positions. The institutional responses show growing concern and constraint. The timeline shows that some form of escalation is probable. And here's the final piece. Something is about to happen that will either resolve this crisis or accelerate it irreversibly. The USMCA review begins in 155 days. The tariff threat remains active. The supply chains continue to reconfigure. And every day that passes without resolution increases the cost of reversal. At some point, the institutions and supply chains that have held this relationship together will be so degraded that negotiation becomes impossible. They will have been replaced by something else, and the question of whether to formally acknowledge the breakage will become secondary to the reality that the breakage has already occurred. That point is not theoretical. It is approaching on a specific timeline, and the institutions that should be preventing it from arriving are constrained by political factors that make prevention increasingly difficult. This is the crisis, not the tariff threat, not the China arrangement, not the political messaging. The crisis is the deterioration of the institutional foundations that have made North American integration work. And that deterioration is accelerating. The question is not whether it will be halted. The question is whether the recognition of what is actually happening will arrive in time for the choices that still remain to be made.